As the financial crisis and economic crisis deepens, working people are asking, how bad is it going to get and how will it affect me? To help us answer those questions, we're joined by Professor Noam Chomsky, who needs no introduction. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
So a few weeks ago, on George Stephanopoulos' show, George Will said the following.
Surely in a democracy, it's time for us to quit being sentimental and say the question we settle in election is not whether elite shall rule, but which elite
No, he
shall
could have answered.
Which was a rather candid moment to see on television. But if for people, ordinary people, working people in swing states now, where their vote might help determine which section of the elite is going to rule, should it matter to them?
Not only should matter, but does matter and has mattered right through American history. Actually, George Will is essentially correct in the terms of the framing of the way American democracy is supposed to work. James Madison, the main framer, his view, as he expressed it at the Constitutional Convention, was that power should be in the hands of the wealth of the nation. The responsible set of men, of course, who respect the rights of property. And the goal of the government should be to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And that thesis runs right to the contemporary period. Perhaps the most famous exponent of it was the leading figure in American media, the leading public intellectual in the 20th century, Walter Lippman, who wrote progressive essays on democracy. He was a Wilson Roosevelt progressive. His view was that the population should be spectators, not participants. They should, he called them ignorant and meddlesome outsiders who have to be kept out of the political arena. And we smart guys who have to run things have to be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd. That's you guys out there. On the other hand, the population has never accepted this, has always struggled against it. Jacksonian democracy is a famous case, but it continues. The benefits, the freedom that we have now is because of popular struggles. The popular struggles in the 1930s compelled the government to create New Deal measures. In the 1960s, it led to civil rights, Medicare, welfare state measures, women's rights, and so on. Every single one of them was, if you look, as the result of people simply not accepting the doctrine of elite rule. And it's true today. You just take a look at polls. A spectacular 95% of the population, which is amazing for a poll, object that the government doesn't pay attention to popular opinion.
There's been sort of a traditional analysis, on the left, that there's a section of the elite that's more connected to the military-industrial complex, a section of the elite that's more connected to domestic economy, needs a more vigorous domestic purchasing power, and certainly overlap. Does that analysis hold up? And if so, for ordinary people, is it better to have one section of the elite empower the other? I mean, right now, if you're in a swing state, you're going to decide McCain or Obama. Is there a decision that matters to people? And what would you suggest if you're in a swing state?
Well, I would suggest voting against McCain, which means voting for Obama without illusions, because all the elevated rhetoric about change and hope and so on will dissolve into standard centrist Democrat policies as soon as, if he takes office. However, there is a difference, and it's been studied quite closely by political scientists. There's a strong difference over time. Don't see it at any particular moment, but over time, the general population, the large majority of the population, other than the very wealthy, tends to do considerably better under Democratic than under Republican administrations. And the reason is sort of what you said. They reflect different elite constituencies. And the differences are quite striking and very noticeable. So if that's what matters to you, well, that's usually a pretty good guide for voting. It's not that the Democrats represent public opinion. They don't. In fact, like the Republicans, they're pretty well to the right of public opinion on a host of major issues, including those of most importance to the public. In fact, what's happening now, it's interesting, it's not being discussed, is very striking. It tells you a lot about American democracy. For years, decades in fact, one of the leading concerns, if not the top concern of the public, has been the healthcare system, which is understandable. It's a total catastrophe. It has about twice the costs of other industrial countries and some of the worst outcomes. And it's painful for individuals. If you've ever spent a little time at an ER watching people come for a bad cold, you can see what it's like.
We've been doing work in various states, in Northwest Indiana, and Virginia, and other places. It's all people want to talk about is the healthcare system.
Yeah,
jobs or healthcare.
And there's good reason for it. It's a catastrophe. It's getting much worse. It's going to swamp the federal budget. And the fundamental reason for it is it's privatized. That introduces layer after layer of bureaucracy, cherry picking, supervision, paperwork. It amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars of waste a year. Well, up until the 2004 election, it was just off the agenda. People mention the Clinton program, but that's misunderstanding. A program, what the public has wanted is very straightforward. They want a national health care system. Usually people pick Canada as the model, not because it's the best system, but because it's right there. You see it. You don't see the Australian system, which is better. But the public, by large majorities, has favored a national health care system, say Medicare Plus, it's sometimes called, extended to the whole population, which would be far cheaper, far
now
more
Obama
efficient.
doesn't go there. Obama does not go there.
Well, see, it's quite interesting to see what's happened. Up until 2004, nobody went there. So the last debate before the election in 2004 was on the domestic economy and concerns. And now 2008 is different. In 2008, both Democratic candidates, Clinton and Obama, did make proposals which, as you say, were not what the public wants, but were approaching it. Well, what happened between 2004 and 2008 to make it politically possible? Public opinion didn't change. What changed is that a major sector of concentrations of real power, namely manufacturing industry, they changed their position. So General Motors says that it costs them over $1,000 more to make a car in Detroit than across the border in Windsor, Canada, because of the inefficient healthcare system. Well, when a large sector of concentrated capital, concentrated economic power, becomes interested in something, it becomes politically possible. So now it's moving to the political agenda. They're not getting there. What does that tell you about the functioning of American democracy? It's very revealing, and it is doubly revealing that nobody comments on it.
What, just to, in this segment of the interview, just to concentrate more on the politics of this election, what do you say to the third-party candidates who say they are all the same, and there really is that we're locked in this dilemma, they say, of one party or the other, the lesser of evils and such? What do you say to them when they say it really doesn't make any difference who wins?
To say it doesn't make any difference who wins is simply to express your contempt for the general population, because it does make a difference. A lot of what they say is correct. The two parties are effectively factions of one party, the business party, but the factions are somewhat different. And as I mentioned, over time, the differences show up in benefits, working conditions, wages, things that really matter to people. So yes, there's a difference. It's a narrow difference, and the spectrum within the political system is well to the right of popular opinion. Incidentally, the public is well aware of it. So 80% of the population say that the government is run by, I'm quoting, a few big interests looking out for themselves, not the population. And they're, you can argue about the details, but the picture is essentially correct and they don't like it. Nevertheless, there is some difference, and you have to make a choice. If you're in a swing state, you have to ask, is this difference enough for me to pick the lesser of the two evils? And there's nothing wrong with picking the lesser of two evils. Cliche makes it sound like you're doing something bad, but no, you're doing something good if you pick the lesser of two evils. So is it worth doing that, or is it worth trying to act to create a potential alternative? For example, should I vote Green because maybe someday their party building, there'll be a real alternative? Should I express my disdain for the right-wing orientation of both parties by not voting, let's say? Or should I pick the lesser of the two evils, thereby helping people? Okay, that's a decision people have to make.
In the next segment of our interview, let's talk about the current financial crisis and what do people mean when they talk about the financial crisis and the real economy, as if they're two different planets. Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Professor Noam Chomsky.
We support the Real News Network because we want to have independent journalism. And in a democracy, there's nothing more important than the free flow of information. Please join with us and help support the Real News Network.
Welcome back to the second part of our interview with Professor Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, ordinary people are trying to understand the current crisis, financial crisis, that people have been already suffering from what they call a crisis in the real economy, and maybe have not yet quite felt the effects of what the financial crisis is going to mean to day-to-day life. So quickly, are we moving into something that resembles a serious depression, as some people are suggesting? And if we are, do you think we might see some of the similar radicalization of the working class that we saw during the 1930s? But start from helping us understand, what are we moving into here?
Well, the immediate crisis that's on the front pages is the financial crisis. The credit system has frozen, so banks don't lend to each other, they don't trust each other. You want to get the housing market has collapsed. These are things that, of course, influence people's lives directly, so it's not happening kind of in the stratosphere. But it does, the visible crisis, the one that's discussed, has to do with finance. However, there is a growing crisis in the rest of the economy too, and it's a serious one. That's why the automakers are disappearing, for example. There's a major crisis coming along which is going to dwarf this one, and that's the growth in medical costs. You look at the trajectory of and extend it, the medical system, highly inefficient medical system, is going to swamp the federal budget. This is usually described as a benefit system, medicine, Medicare, and Social Security, but that's just a technique to try to destroy Social Security. Social Security is in pretty good shape. It's the health system that's the problem, and but the immediate problem is the financial system. The roots go back to the early 1970s, when finance was liberalized, it was freed from the constraints of the post-war period. Now, the constraints of the post-war period, roughly 1945 to 1970, they were instituted by the United States and Britain for a reason. One, because it was assumed correctly that allowing governments to control capital movements and currencies would provide a basis for rapidly expanding growth and trade and so on, which indeed happened. That's called the golden age of modern capitalism, whereas freeing these constraints would retard growth and development, as indeed it is done. But there was a second reason, which isn't being discussed much. Allowing governments to control capital movements provides them with a certain space for introducing what we call welfare state programs. If capital movements are free, tax on currencies are free, there's what economists call a virtual parliament of investors and lenders who actually vote every minute, in fact, If they don't like what a government is doing, they attack the currency. There's capital flight.
And how likely is world capital to vote no faith any longer in U.S. Treasury bonds? Is that really a possibility?
No, in fact, they're fleeing to U.S. Treasury
now, but they're in this push-pull. Either they have to defend it or abandon it, and right now they're defending it. Is there any choice to abandon it, or they really don't have one?
No, because the United States is despite all the crisis, is far and away the richest and most powerful country in the world, and if the United States tanks, the world economy will tank. So it's a safe bet. If you want security, yes, get Treasury bonds. But the system has unacceptable risk built into it. It's well known among economists that markets are inefficient from the narrowest perspective. So to make it simple, suppose you sell me a car, okay? We may make a good deal for ourselves. We're not taking into account the effect on him. It's what's called an externality. And there's an effect. If you sell me a car, it increases gas prices, increases pollution, increases congestion, and that extends very broadly. The so-called externalities can be very large. Now, in financial institutions, it's far worse. They're in the business of taking risks. If they're well managed, say Goldman Sachs, they calculate the potential cost to themselves if there's a loss, but the important words are to themselves. They don't calculate in what's called systemic risk, the effect on the whole system if I go bust, and there's a huge effect. The result is that risk-taking is underpriced, meaning there's a lot more of it than there would be in a reasonable system. And so therefore it was predicted right off that when financial liberalization took place, there would be a more regular financial crises and deeper ones. And this particular one is accelerated by the fact that there was a subprime housing bubble and many other factors, so it became far more severe than anyone expected. But it's built into the system. Now, this was combined with a kind of religious market fundamentalism based on doctrines of self-regulating markets and so on, which are pure fantasy. So the regulatory apparatus was dismantled. Well, that accelerates the pace of potential financial crises. Also, and along with that came the creation of highly exotic financial instruments. Well, all of this combined, it was pretty clear in the early part of this decade that a major crisis was brewing. Alan Greenspan, head of Federal Reserve, refused to prick the bubble, as could have been done in simple ways, on the basis of religious belief in self-regulating markets. And finally it came to this catastrophe where there's a credit freeze, the system's freezing up. Something has to be done. And it's interesting what the choices are. It goes back to our earlier discussion. So this morning on the radio, George Bush announced that the government is intervening in the banks, but we want to make sure that we go back to the profit motive, not policy motives, not political motives. What are political motives? Well, that means participation of the population in making decisions. So we hate democracy. We don't want the public to be involved in decisions about things. We want to go back to the profit motive, meaning that a private tyranny, which is what a corporation is, should look out for itself, not for the public interest.
Which is what got us here. It's interesting, for the first times when one is hearing the discourse open up, and maybe they don't like the way the word socialism and capitalism, even as words, are actually entering the public discourse.
I don't think it has anything to do with socialism. That's a scare word. It has to do with democracy. So what is being called government intervention in a democracy would mean intervention of the population. I mean, if you believe the 4th of July speeches, of government of, by, and for the people, then the government is not some alien force stealing from you. Government intervention means giving the public a role in making decisions about things that matter to them, like working conditions and wages and so on and so forth. And in democracy, political motives would mean the interests of the population in determining what's going to happen next. If you decode the rhetoric The question is, do we want private concentrations of power to make decisions for their own benefit, or do we want the public to be concerned to make decisions for the public welfare? That's what's really behind it.
For ordinary people, as this crisis deepens, what do you think they can do? What should they do?
It's very striking. When the $700 billion bailout was announced, the public was outraged. There was furious objection, so much so that the House of Representatives had to vote it down. Now, on the surface, that looks like an exercise of democracy, but it isn't. Even in a dictatorship, if the dictator does something outrageous, the public can riot and they'll have to back down. Now, in a democracy, functioning democracy, what would happen is different. Not just shouting no, which is what happened, but active popular organizations like unions or political clubs or whatever would be coming forth with specific proposals and demanding that their representatives implement them. And there are proposals. There's quite a lot of proposals on the table. Joseph Stiglitz, who's not a voice from outer space, made a very simple point. He said, if we put money into the banks, pour liquidity into the banks, we can pour it in and they'll pour it out. Mergers and acquisitions, anything for their own benefit, because that's what they're in business for their benefit, not for our benefit. So he said we have to have veto power. Well, veto power means voting rights. And if it's a real democracy, voting rights means popular participation and initiative. The initiative should be coming from the population, like with healthcare, where the population has definite views. But the country is so depoliticized that popular views are considered politically impossible, lacking political support. Well, that's what's called a democratic deficit, formal democratic institutions, but not functioning. And we have to overcome that. That underlies lots of issues.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky, and thank you very much for joining us.